The night shift at St. Calder Memorial had already gone to chaos when Dr. Wesley Voss turned on the rookie nurse in front of the entire emergency department. He told Serena Vale she acted like a soldier on a battlefield instead of a medical professional. She said nothing back. Hours later, 6 men in black tactical uniforms walked through the hospital doors, demanding to see her by name. When Serena stepped into the lobby, all 6 snapped to attention and saluted her like a commanding officer who had once saved their lives. Nobody in that building understood who she really was. Before we get into how this story unfolds, if you enjoy true-to-life stories about quiet heroes and the people underestimated until the moment everything changes, go ahead and hit subscribe so you never miss the next one. Now, let's get back to Serena. 6 months had passed since Serena Vale walked through the doors of St. Calder Memorial for the first time. And in all that time, nobody in the emergency department had managed to learn much about her. She arrived early for every shift, never late by even a minute, and left without lingering in the break room the way the other nurses did. Her file listed her as a graduate of a transition program for military veterans entering civilian medicine, but the page stopped there. As if someone had decided that was enough for anyone to know. What people noticed instead were small habits that did not quite fit the rhythm of a hospital. She kept an old brass compass in her breast pocket, its surface worn smooth from years of handling, though no one had ever seen her use it for anything practical. Whenever she entered an unfamiliar room, her eyes would flick toward the exits before they settled on the patient, a motion so quick that most people missed it entirely. Dr. Leah Stroud had caught it once, during her first week shadowing Serena, and filed it away as something to ask about eventually. That chance came on a slow evening when the emergency room had quieted to its usual late-hour lull. Leah found Serena restocking gauze in the supply closet and offered her a cup of coffee from the machine in the break room, more out of curiosity than courtesy. To her surprise, Serena accepted, and the two of them sat across from each other at a table scarred with years of coffee rings and hospital memos nobody had bothered to take down. The conversation started awkwardly, the way conversations do between two people who have nothing in common except the workplace. Leah asked the obvious questions about where Serena had trained, what made her choose nursing, whether she missed her old career. Most of the answers were short, polite, and gave away almost nothing. But near the end, when Leah asked why nursing specifically, Serena's expression shifted into something quieter and more honest. "I just want a job where I know when I go home at night that I helped keep someone alive," she said, turning her cup slowly between her hands. Leah did not fully understand the weight behind those words, but she felt it anyway, the way you feel the depth of water before you ever step into it. It was a small moment, easy to forget in the noise of a busy hospital, but it planted something in Leah that would not let go of her later. Across the department, Dr. Wesley Voss ran the emergency room the way he had run it for the better part of a decade, with absolute certainty that his judgment was the only one that mattered. He was skilled, there was no denying that, and the hospital relied on his steady hand during the worst nights. But he had also built his reputation on being the loudest voice in any room, and Serena's calm, unreadable presence unsettled him in a way he could not quite name. He had decided early on that she was a problem waiting to happen, a nurse with no proper medical pedigree who somehow carried herself like she had seen things no rookie should have seen. Maribel Knox, the head nurse who had been at St. Calder longer than almost anyone on staff, saw it differently. She watched Serena move through trauma cases with a precision that took most nurses years to develop, and she kept her observations to herself, waiting to see how the rest of the staff would respond. The night that changed everything began with rain hammering against the ambulance bay doors and a call coming in about a scaffolding collapse down at the Briarport docks. Within 20 minutes, the emergency room had filled with construction workers, covered in dust and blood, some screaming, others eerily silent in a way that worried the staff more than the screaming did. Triage turned into a blur of clipboards, raised voices, and gurneys being wheeled in faster than anyone could properly assess them. In the middle of that chaos, Serena's attention locked onto one worker who had been waved through to the waiting area, marked as non-critical, by an exhausted intern who had 15 other patients pulling at his focus. Something about the man's breathing caught her eye, shallow and uneven, in a way that did not match his outward calm. She crouched beside him without waiting for permission, pressed 2 fingers to his abdomen, and felt him flinch in a way that told her everything the chart had missed. She called for blood and a trauma bay before anyone else in the room had even registered the man's name, directing 2 orderlies to move him with the kind of authority that made people obey before they thought to question it. Voss was 3 patients away when he heard her voice cutting through the noise, sharp and certain, and he turned just in time to see her taking control of a situation that was not hers to command. By the time he reached the trauma bay, Serena already had the bleeding under control, working with a steadiness that looked less like nursing and more like something practiced under far worse conditions. The worker survived, and later the surgeon would confirm that another 20 minutes of internal bleeding would have killed him. But survival did not soften Voss's reaction. He waited until the room had cleared enough for an audience, then called Serena out in front of nurses, residents, and even a few lingering family members who had not yet been moved to the waiting area. "This is a hospital, not a battlefield, and you do not get to act like you're running a unit out there," he said, his voice carrying easily across the department. He went on for nearly a full minute, listing every way she had overstepped her role, every protocol she had bypassed, every reason her instincts could not be trusted in a place built on careful procedure rather than gut decisions made under fire. Nurses near the nurses' station stopped what they were doing to watch, and even Maribel, who rarely interfered in Voss's outbursts, felt her jaw tighten at the cruelty of it. Serena did not argue. She stood with her hands loosely at her sides, her expression unreadable, and let every word land without flinching. That stillness, more than anything she could have said in her own defense, seemed to unsettle Voss even further. He had expected an excuse, a flash of temper, something he could push back against. Instead, he got silence. And silence from someone who had just saved a man's life in front of him felt to his ego like a quiet kind of defiance. By the next morning, that defiance had calcified into something Voss decided he needed to act on. He drafted a formal complaint to hospital administration describing Serena as exhibiting excessive military reflexes, poor adherence to protocol, and a possible risk to patient safety. He used careful clinical language designed to sound like concern rather than retaliation, the kind of phrasing that would hold up under review, even though everyone who had witnessed the scaffolding incident knew exactly what it really was. Maribel found Serena in the supply room later that day, restocking shelves with the same methodical calm she brought to everything, and gently suggested that she consider telling administration at least part of the truth about her background. A small disclosure, Maribel reasoned, might be enough to explain her instincts without forcing her to reveal everything she clearly wanted to keep buried. Serena shook her head before Maribel had even finished the thought, her hands stilling over a stack of bandages. "If I open that door even a little, it doesn't stay a little," Serena said, her voice low but firm. She explained as much as she allowed herself to, that the moment people learned what she used to do, they would stop seeing her as a nurse and start seeing her as something else entirely. Something to be watched or feared or quietly resented. She had left that version of herself behind for a reason, and she was not ready to let it walk back into a hospital hallway, no matter what it cost her. Maribel did not push further, though. The worry stayed etched in her face long after Serena had moved on to the next task. Leah, who had heard secondhand about the complaint, found herself replaying the conversation in the break room days earlier, the quiet admission about wanting to help someone stay alive, and wondering just how much more there was to the woman she had barely begun to know. Serena spent the rest of that day moving through her shift as though nothing had changed, checking vitals, charting notes, answering call lights with the same unflinching calm that had defined her since her first week. But beneath the surface, the choice she had made sat heavier than she let on. Staying silent meant trusting that the life she had built here was worth more than the truth she had buried to build it. By the time her shift ended and she stepped out into the cold night air outside St. Calder Memorial, the decision had already hardened into something she would not easily undo. Whatever came next, she would face it as Serena Vale, registered nurse, and nothing more than that. She had no way of knowing yet how soon that choice would be tested, or how little control she would have once it was. The complaint Wesley Voss filed against Serena moved through the hospital faster than anyone expected, and within days, the atmosphere of the emergency department had shifted in ways that were impossible to ignore. Nurses who used to nod at her in passing now found reasons to look elsewhere, and whispered conversations near the supply closet died down the moment she walked by. Someone had started a rumor that she was struggling with some unnamed condition left over from her military service. The kind of thing that made people uneasy, without anyone having to say exactly what they meant. Leah tried twice to approach her during a quiet stretch of the shift, hoping to offer some kind of support after everything she had witnessed since the night of the scaffolding collapse. Both times, Serena kept her answers brief and her body angled slightly away, a clear signal that she did not want anyone pulled into the consequences of Voss's report. Voss, for his part, seemed almost energized by the shift in mood around the department, assigning Serena to restocking duties and paperwork far below her actual responsibilities, correcting her charting over the smallest details. That opening seemed to arrive in an unexpected form on a Tuesday afternoon when paramedics wheeled in a man who had collapsed at the downtown train station. His chart identified him as Caleb Rourke, a former Marine in his early 30s, found unconscious on a platform bench by a commuter who had assumed he was simply asleep. His vital signs were unstable, but not alarming enough to draw much attention in a department already stretched thin, and an intern quickly assigned him a bed with a note to monitor and reassess. Serena was the one who drew his blood and checked his vitals 20 minutes later, and the moment she leaned over him, something in his eyes seemed to focus despite his disorientation. His hand shot up and closed around her wrist with surprising strength for someone barely conscious. His gaze locking onto her face as though he were trying to place a memory buried somewhere beneath the haze of whatever was affecting him. Haven. He whispered the single word slipping out before his eyes drifted shut again. Serena went still for the briefest instant, her pulse spiking in a way that had nothing to do with the patient in front of her. She gently freed her wrist from his grip, checked his pupils, and continued the assessment as though nothing unusual had happened, though the words sat lodged in her chest like a splinter she could not yet examine. She noted everything that did not add up about his presentation. The shallow, irregular breathing, the faint discoloration along his wrist that looked less like a bruise and more like exposure to something chemical, the way his fingers curled inward in small, involuntary spasms whenever his hand rested still. It was a pattern she recognized from another life entirely, one that had nothing to do with ordinary illness, and everything to do with low-dose nerve agent exposure. She brought her concerns to Voss immediately, describing the symptoms with the same clinical precision she used for every patient. He barely looked up from the chart in front of him, telling her flatly that she was reading too much into a routine collapse, and that her tendency to escalate situations beyond their actual severity was exactly the behavior his report had warned about. He moved on to the next patient without waiting for her response, leaving her standing there with a certainty he refused to acknowledge. Less than an hour later, Caleb's condition turned violent and fast. His body seized without warning, his back arching off the gurney as monitors began screaming alarms that pulled half the department toward his bed. Serena reached him first, holding his head steady to keep him from injuring himself, while calling out instructions that the surrounding staff followed without question, the urgency in her voice leaving no room for hesitation. In the chaos of stabilizing him, her eyes caught on a thin chain around his neck, half hidden beneath his hospital gown. And on it hung a small metal tag, stamped with a symbol she had not seen in years. It was the mark of Kestrel 9, the unit she had once belonged to in a life she rarely allowed herself to think about during daylight hours. Seeing it here, on a man who had whispered her old call sign before losing consciousness, told her this was not a random medical emergency at all. As soon as Caleb's seizure passed, and he had been stabilized enough for the moment, broken fragments of words spilled from his lips, barely audible over the equipment around him. He muttered something about a warehouse, then a green container, then a desperate plea not to let someone open it. Serena leaned closer, piecing together what little she could, and the picture that formed in her mind sent a cold certainty through her chest. Somewhere at the Briarport docks, a shipment rigged with some kind of toxic agent was sitting in wait, and Caleb had likely been the last person to carry that warning before whoever silenced him caught up to him. She stepped away from the bed once the immediate crisis had passed, walked to a quiet corner near the nurse's station and picked up a hospital phone instead of her personal cell, knowing better than to leave any trace that could be tracked back to her directly. She dialed a number she had not used in years, one that only former members of Kestrel 9 would recognize. And when the line connected, she gave no name and offered no explanation. She said only 3 words before hanging up. "Harbor is hot." For the rest of her shift, Serena moved through her duties with the same outward composure she always carried, though every part of her remained braced for what might come next. The answer came faster than she expected. By early evening, hospital administration received a call from a federal agency requesting immediate access to the building, citing a national security matter and naming Serena Vale specifically as the person they needed to speak with. Word of the call spread through the department within minutes, distorted and exaggerated with each retelling, until almost no one had an accurate picture of what was actually happening. Voss heard the news with a grim satisfaction he did not bother to hide, convinced this was finally the proof he needed that Serena was exactly the liability he had always claimed. He straightened his coat and positioned himself near the lobby entrance, ready to be the one who explained the situation to whoever walked through those doors. What walked through those doors instead was nothing like what he expected. 6 men in dark tactical uniforms entered the lobby, with a quiet, controlled discipline that silenced every conversation within sight of them. At their front was a tall, broad-shouldered man whose presence alone seemed to command the room, later identified by his uniform insignia as Captain Ronan Slate. He scanned the lobby once methodically, before his eyes settled on Voss standing nearby in his white coat. Voss stepped forward immediately, already forming the explanation he had rehearsed in his head about Serena's behavioral concerns and the risks she posed to the department. Ronan did not let him finish a single sentence. "Where is Nurse Vale?" he said, his voice even and absolute, carrying none of the urgency one might expect from a question of national importance, only certainty. Voss faltered, the practiced words dying in his throat, as he realized this conversation was not going to unfold the way he had imagined. Serena emerged from the corridor leading to the emergency department a moment later, drawn by the sudden silence that had fallen over the lobby. Her eyes moved across the 6 faces in front of her, and recognition hit her one by one. Each face pulling a memory to the surface she had buried alongside the rest of her old life. There was the soldier she had once bandaged under gunfire, in a mission that had nearly cost them both everything. And another she had genuinely believed had not survived a different operation years earlier. For a single, unguarded moment, the composure she had carried through every confrontation with Voss slipped, entirely replaced by something raw and unprotected. Before she could speak, all 6 men snapped to attention and saluted her in perfect unison. The gesture, so precise and so reverent that the entire lobby seemed to hold its breath. Nobody watching understood what they were seeing. Only that the woman they had dismissed as a troubled rookie was being honored by soldiers as though she outranked every authority in the building. Ronan lowered his salute, first stepping closer to address her directly, while the rest of the hospital looked on in stunned silence. He explained briefly and without unnecessary detail that her warning had allowed his unit to intercept a shipment at the Briarport docks before it could be opened. A shipment rigged with a chemical agent capable of killing hundreds of people in the surrounding area. Caleb Rourke, he confirmed, had been the final courier of that warning before he was silenced. And without Serena recognizing what his condition meant, the information would have died with him. Then Ronan said the name that no one in that hospital had ever heard attached to her before the one she had carried through every mission with Kestrel 9, and had not spoken aloud since the day she walked away from that life. Haven, he said. And the word landed in the lobby, like a confession finally being spoken into open air. Serena's hand drifted briefly toward the worn compass in her pocket, the one nobody had ever asked about, the one that suddenly made a different kind of sense to anyone paying close enough attention. The truth she had spent 6 months protecting now stood fully exposed under the fluorescent lights of a hospital lobby, witnessed by colleagues, administrators, and strangers alike. She had been cleared of every accusation Voss had made against her. But the cost of that clearance was the one thing she had never wanted to give up, the quiet, ordinary version of herself she had worked so hard to build. Voss stood frozen near the edge of the crowd, his earlier certainty collapsing into something that looked far more like fear, as the woman he had tried to discredit was revealed to be exactly the kind of person whose judgment should never have been questioned in the first place. In the days that followed Ronan's visit, the hospital settled into an uneasy quiet that felt nothing like the ordinary rhythm Serena had once worked so hard to protect. Conversations stopped the moment she entered a room, not out of avoidance the way they had after Voss's complaint, but out of something closer to disbelief. People who had once whispered about her instability now struggled to reconcile that image with a woman soldiers had saluted in the middle of a hospital lobby. Wesley Voss tried in the days immediately following to recover some version of his authority within the department. He told anyone who would listen that he had simply been following proper protocol, that questioning an employee's conduct was well within his responsibilities, regardless of what came to light afterward. Maribel finally found the moment she had been waiting for, to respond to him directly. Protocol was never a reason to humiliate someone in front of patients and staff, she said, standing her ground in the hallway outside his office, where several nurses could overhear the exchange. She reminded him, calmly, but without softening a single word, that his complaint had never been about genuine safety concerns, but about his discomfort with a nurse whose competence he could not control or fully explain. Voss had no answer for her that did not sound like another excuse. And for the first time since Serena's arrival, he chose silence instead of argument. Leah carried a different kind of weight in those same days, one rooted less in anger and more in quiet guilt. She had stood in that emergency department during Voss's public reprimand of Serena and said nothing in her defense, telling herself at the time that it was not her place to intervene. Watching the lobby scene unfold had forced her to confront how much that silence had cost. She found Serena alone in the break room one evening, sitting at the same scarred table where they had shared coffee months earlier, and sat down across from her without waiting for an invitation. It was Leah who finally broke the quiet between them. "You told me once that you just wanted to know you helped keep someone alive," Leah said, turning her own cup slowly between her hands, the way Serena had done months before. "I think I finally understand what that actually meant." Serena's expression softened slightly at the memory, the first real shift in her composure since the lobby had erupted into chaos days earlier. And for a moment, the two of them sat together without needing to say anything more. Serena made one thing clear to Maribel and Leah both in the days that followed, repeating it whenever the subject of her past came up among the staff. She had no interest in being treated as some kind of hero or curiosity, and she did not want her history with Kestrel 9 turned into break-room gossip passed between shifts. All she wanted, she explained, was to keep doing her job without people deciding in advance what she was capable of based on rumors instead of her actual work. The hospital's administrative review concluded faster than anyone expected, helped along by federal confirmation of exactly what Serena's actions had prevented at the Briarport docks. Every accusation in Voss's original complaint was formally withdrawn, and his report itself became the subject of an internal review into his conduct as head of the department. He was required to issue a direct apology to both Serena and Maribel in front of the rest of the emergency room staff, a request that visibly cost him more than any clinical correction ever had. When the moment came, Voss delivered the apology stiffly, his eyes more often on the floor than on either woman standing in front of him. Serena listened without interrupting, and when he finished, she did not respond with the satisfaction he might have braced himself for. "What scares me isn't that you were wrong about me," she said, her voice steady enough to carry across the quiet department. "It's that you've probably treated other people the same way, and they didn't have a special operations unit walk through the door to prove them right." The room went still around her words, the weight of them settling over nurses and residents who had each, at some point, watched someone be dismissed or diminished without speaking up themselves. It was no longer just about Serena and Voss, but about every quiet assumption the hospital had let slide unchallenged for years. Before Ronan Slade and the rest of his unit left St. Calder Memorial for good, he asked to speak with Serena privately, away from the lingering attention of hospital staff still processing everything they had witnessed. They stood near the ambulance bay, where the rain from the night of the scaffolding collapse had long since cleared the air between them, carrying the kind of ease that only existed between people who had once trusted each other with their lives. "You pulled this whole team out of a mission nobody thought we'd walk away from," Ronan said, his tone losing the formal edge it had carried inside the hospital. "Whether you're wearing fatigues or scrubs, you're still doing the same thing you always did. You just figure out how to bring people home." Serena allowed herself, for the first time since the lobby reveal, to simply accept the gratitude being offered to her, instead of deflecting it the way she had with every compliment since arriving at the hospital. By the time Kestrel 9 departed, the sound of their boots fading from the hospital corridors felt less like an ending and more like a closing chapter she could finally set down. St. Calder Memorial began returning to its familiar rhythm within days, the shock of that afternoon settling into something closer to quiet respect than open curiosity. Serena returned to her usual rotation in the emergency department, charting vitals, checking monitors, and moving through her shifts with the same steady focus she had carried since her very first day. Near the end of one ordinary evening shift, an elderly patient in one of the recovery beds fumbled with a cup of water on his bedside tray, his trembling hands sending it tumbling before he could catch it. Nobody else in the busy department noticed the small spill, or the embarrassed frustration crossing his face as the cup rolled toward the floor. Serena did, and without hesitation, she crossed the room, picked up the cup, refilled it from the pitcher nearby, and gently placed it back into his open hand. It was a small gesture, the kind that would never make it into any official record or hospital commendation. But it captured something true about who Serena Vale actually was. Beneath every layer the day had peeled away. She did not need a battlefield to prove her worth. And she did not need a weapon, a medal, or an old call sign to define what kind of person she had become. Whether on a covert mission overseas or in a quiet hospital room at the end of a long shift, she remained someone who showed up exactly when it mattered most. Leah caught sight of her a moment later, walking down the corridor toward the next patient on her list, her pace as unhurried and deliberate as it had always been. Nobody in the department called her the rookie anymore, not after everything the past week had revealed about who she truly was. But Serena did not need to be called a hero either. And she did not look back to see who might be watching as she reached up and straightened the small badge pinned to her scrubs, the one that read simply, "Serena Vale, Registered Nurse." There is a quiet lesson in Serena's story worth carrying with you. Never assume you know the full measure of a person just because they are soft-spoken, modest, or standing somewhere low on the ladder in front of you. Some people carry extraordinary chapters of their lives in silence, not because there is nothing to be proud of, but because they have learned that real worth never needs to announce itself. Kindness, skill, and courage rarely arrive wrapped in spectacle. Sometimes the person you are quickest to overlook in the room is the one who has already given the most to protect everyone else in it. If this story moved you, take a second to subscribe and turn on notifications so the next one finds you when it's ready. It genuinely helps the channel keep telling stories like Serena's, and we'd love to have you with us for what comes next.